There's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamma Mia podcast.
Mamma Mia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on.
This episode contains graphic depictions of violent crimes. Listener discretion is advised.
Kananook railway station is located on the Frankston line in Victoria, about 50 minutes from Melbourne's CBD. At approximately 10:20 p.m. on the 11th of July 1990, a 23-year-old woman named Sarah MacDiarmid can be seen alighting from the train and walking in the direction of the poorly lit car park where she parked her red Honda Civic that morning. She is no doubt in a hurry to get home. She has work in the morning and her train has been running 20 minutes late. Despite it being late on a Wednesday night, there are people around. They see the woman, with blonde hair, holding a tennis racket. She crosses the footbridge. Someone will later remember a female voice shouting, "Give me back my keys." We won't know if that voice belongs to Sarah. Between the footbridge and sliding into the driver's seat of her car, Sarah vanishes into thin air. There are traces that she made it to her vehicle, but someone, or perhaps a group of people, targeted her. But who? And why? Will we ever know for certain what happened to Sarah MacDiarmid on that night in the middle of winter 3 decades ago? I'm Jessie Stevens and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamma Mia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. Today's episode is about Sarah MacDiarmid, who vanished from Victoria's Kananook railway station in July 1990. Helping us tell this story is true crime author Vicky Petratus, whose podcast, Searching for Sarah MacDiarmid, analyses the timeline and the evidence surrounding her disappearance. Tell me a little bit about who Sarah MacDiarmid was in 1990.
Sarah MacDiarmid was a 23-year-old young woman, and she and her family had not long come over from Scotland. They had lived in Australia when she was a much younger child. They'd lived up north, and they went back for a family business, and the kids finished their education, her and her brother Alistair. And then she came back as a university-educated young woman. She had just got a job at an insurance place, and she was living her best life.
It was Wednesday, the 11th of July 1990, when Sarah joined some friends for tennis. What do we know about the events that evening?
She played tennis with a couple of friends from her work, and then she and 2 other friends hopped on the train, the Frankston train, and she just found out that one of the other guys that she worked with, Gavin, lived in Bondi Beach, and they caught the same train line. And so he and his girlfriend decided that they would spend the night at his place rather than going back to her place, which they usually did. And so they all hopped on the train in the city. So they got off at Bondi Beach, just, a stop before Sarah, and they waved goodbye to her. It was about 10:15, and then she kept going and hopped off at the Kananook railway station.
And when she hopped off, had she parked there so she was going to get into her car and then drive home?
Yeah, she had parked at the station. The family had just moved in February up to Frankston, and the woman they bought the house from said, "Park at Kananook, it's safer." And so she did that every morning. And of course, she wasn't normally home this late, just on the days that she played tennis. And just to set the scene too, before I started researching this, I kind of had this picture of a woman hopping off the train at 10:20 at night, all on her own. But there were people everywhere. There were so many witnesses that came forward that had gotten off the train at the same time. So she's hopping off at a fairly busy station at a kind of busy time of night. Kananook Station is one of those stations that's in the middle of the 2 train lines, and to access it you have to go up a ramp and cross an overpass. And so she did that. She walked up the ramp. People saw her. She stood out because she had a tracksuit on and was carrying a tennis racket with her other bags. And she just had to walk up the ramp, across the overpass and down the stairs to the car park. And she was never seen again.
So her parents, who she lived with, they have a 23-year-old daughter who has been out that day, hasn't come home. At what stage did they begin to panic and actually alert police? Because that's a difficult thing to know when to do that when your child is an adult and may have just stayed at a friend's house or something.
Yeah, that is always that dilemma. They kind of started to panic straight away because Sarah was the kind of person that would ring if she was going to be late. And she had done that not long before. She was going to stay at a friend's place because it was too foggy to drive home after an event that they'd been with. And she called her parents at, midnight to go, just to let you know, I'm not going to be home. So her parents were quite worried almost straight away. Sarah was a person of habit, but Peter MacDiarmid, her dad, used to be in the police force over in the UK, and he said, you just can't ring the police. They're not going to take it seriously when your 23-year-old is half an hour late. I think they had a very uneasy night, and it wasn't until the next day that Sheila MacDiarmid rang Sarah's work so that if she had stayed over with someone from work, she would be at work. And she started ringing at 8 and she kept ringing back. And finally at 9, they said, no, she's not here. And Gavin and Diane, the two people that she'd caught the train with, had just come in, and they said to the work, well, we were on the train with her and we left at Bomb Beach. She was going to get off at Kananook. And that was the first moment that they realised that Sarah had been on the train home and that something had happened. And Sheila talks about in the podcast that she just let out this scream. And that was the moment that they all knew.
And where did police even begin in terms of searching? Did they search to kind of determine whether she had ever gotten off that train? Were they able to find anything?
Yeah, so the police were really good. The minute that the MacDiarmids called, the two local uniform people arrived at their house and they took the statement, and then they went to the car park, and the MacDiarmids knew Sarah's car was still there because the night before, Sarah's brother Alistair had gone down. They'd looked up the train timetable. He'd gone down to meet the final train, knowing that if she didn't get off then, she couldn't get off because there were no more trains. And so he saw the car there. So the police went down. The car, of course, was still there. And they reported straight to the Frankston CIB. And the minute the police met the MacDiarmids, and they're such lovely people, I think that comes across so beautifully in the podcast. It's a lovely family. They're not people to get overly worried unless they really need to be. And I think the police took it seriously because they took them seriously, and they could see straight away that Sarah really wasn't the kind of person to vanish. And the fact that she had caught the train and not made it down to the car park, the Frankston detectives were there. They talked to the MacDiarmids and they went straight down there, and that was when they found blood near her car.
Were they able to determine that that blood belonged to her?
Yeah, so straight away, Cole Clark, one of the Frankston detectives, who is a legend down in Frankston, he was there for years and years, and he could see that at her car there was blood near the car door. It didn't look to them like she had gotten into the car at all. And more disturbingly, they could also see drag marks as if somebody had maybe hoisted her under her arms and dragged her so that the heels have left these parallel drag marks. And they followed these drag marks into the bushes that bordered the car park, and they found a significant amount of blood that had soaked into the soil. So the scenario that immediately posed itself to them was that she had been attacked at her car with some sort of weapon, causing an injury that was going to lead her to bleed a lot, so quite possibly a knife, and that she had been dragged into the bushes and then she had been moved. So the only thing that they found of hers in the bushes was a lighter from the cafe downstairs at Sarah's work in the city. And they realised quite quickly, and this is odd, that whoever did this to her had left her there, we assumed, to go and find a vehicle to move her, but they'd ignored her vehicle as a mode of instant transport. That's the theory as to why she was left there. She certainly wasn't carried away. The police were fairly certain that they would have found a blood trail, but also that she was carrying a backpack with her work clothes because she'd changed after tennis, and she was carrying a tennis racket, and she was carrying a handbag. And so she had all this stuff with her that was also gone. So even if somebody could have carried her away physically, she was only little, they would have struggled, I think, to carry all of the bags and the stuff that she had with her.
Yeah, which they weren't able to recover at that scene, as you say. The tennis racket and the bag and the clothes, all that would have been with her. The question, I suppose, is then, if she got off that train and there were people around, were there any witnesses who heard anything or saw anything that could explain what happened to her?
There were a lot of witnesses, and a lot of witnesses had very different stories. So there were witnesses who saw her going down the stairs or heading toward the stairs to the car park. Those witnesses saw other people heading in that same direction, but no one ever came forward. Someone saw a man carrying a briefcase and someone saw a woman carrying a briefcase. Those two people could have been the same at night, could have been the same person, but that person never came forward. And another woman who said she was on that same train, she said that she got up to the top of the overpass and that she heard a scream and that she heard someone say, "Give me back my keys, stop fooling around." So she was an important witness, like somebody had snatched at Sarah's keys near her car and then there was a really quick scream. Other people that were a little bit further away, waiting for a family member sort of opposite the railway station out on Wells Road, they heard screaming and they had their dogs with them, and then the dogs started barking. But people reported hearing a couple of different voices, some men's voices, screaming. So there wasn't ever one consistent story that explained what had happened to her.
A woman named Jodie Jones came forward in the days after Sarah's disappearance. What did she say?
Jodie Jones is a very interesting person. She had been jailed for killing somebody when she was just 18. Her and a bunch of buddies, for some reason, picked on a guy at St Kilda, and she kind of went up and shirt-fronted him and started hitting at him, and he hit back at her, and then all of her friends just jumped on him and they literally stomped him to death. And these were all teenagers, 17, she just turned 18. They were very young, I guess, troubled kids. And she just got out of jail, I think, in the January or February of that year. And so she had priors for killing somebody really ruthlessly. Jodie claimed, she started telling people pretty much a couple of days after Sarah went missing. She'd say, "Oh, you know that thing at Kananook, I was there with two blokes, but I'm worried they won't stay staunch." And of course, this is at the same moment that she's not staying staunch herself. Other times she talked about she was there with three blokes or she was there with one bloke. Someone reported her saying, yeah, I was responsible for that thing at Kananook. We buried her. Another time she said, yeah, we put her in a dumpster. And so none of the stories that Jodie told many people were even consistent with the stories that she told somebody else. And so the police certainly, within a week or so of Sarah disappearing, they had Jodie and they interviewed her. The problem was that she was a drug abuser. She was a tough criminal. I had the transcript of the police interviews and she basically said, yeah, everyone's lying, I didn't do it, and just kind of fobbed it off. And the police put all of their resources into interviewing every single person that she'd been in contact with, what she'd said, getting statements from all of them. And I think this was complicated very quickly because the police offered a reward. And so there were a lot of people that came forward, including one woman who came forward and said, yep, I was in the car park, I saw it all happen. Jody said, I'm going to rob somebody. She went away and I saw this girl walking past with a tennis racket and I heard screaming and there were these two other guys there. Police followed up on that and then she's interviewed again. And, these kind of statements, they all started with, I had my last hit at heroin at midday today, and they were drug-affected people and the police proved that it was absolutely incorrect and it couldn't have happened like what she said, and that she said it for the reward money. And so it was very much complicated by the fact that perhaps the people in Jodie's circles, some of them might say things in order to get a reward that might allow them to buy drugs. That was the really harsh reality that the police faced.
The Frankston serial killer, who we now know is Paul Denyer, he killed 3 young women in the years afterwards. Is it possible he was responsible for Sarah's disappearance?
Look, I think that it's really possible. And the thing was that when Sarah went missing in 1990, Paul Denyer hadn't done anything. So it wasn't like the police could look around in 1990 and say, could it have been Denyer? Because those crimes hadn't occurred yet. But by his own admission, Paul was certainly stalking women. He talks about stalking them from when he was 17, and he was 18 and 3 months when this all went down. His brother lived in the area. He spent time, according to his sister-in-law, at their place. And I think that when Paul confessed to the 3, it was an interesting situation where for 6 hours he sat in the interview room and he denied it all. He said, I was close to there and that night, but wasn't me. And he was very cool, calm and collected. And it wasn't until a break in the interview where they say, we're going to take a blood sample and we're going to test it against DNA. And that's when he said, they're going to know that I did it. Okay, I did all 3 of them. And right at the end of the interview, they asked him about Sarah. And, they said, that girl at Kananook. And he said, Sarah MacDiarmid, no, that wasn't me. He also referenced Michelle Brown as well. He said, that Brown girl, that wasn't me either. I don't know anything about those things. I found that really telling that he could be thinking of those girls and their names right when this should have been really stressful for him. He references, Sarah MacDiarmid, no, that wasn't me. And I think that the police kind of figured, well, he confessed to 3. Why wouldn't he confess to 4? But all through Paul's letters to his family, and I've had access to many, many of his letters, he talks about getting out of prison. Yeah, I've done half of my time here. I've done most of my time here. He fully expected to get out. And I wonder if with Sarah, he would have known if he had have confessed to 4, that wouldn't happen. And I hope it doesn't happen anyway. But I just wonder whether he just thought, well, they don't have anything on that. And that's what's been really interesting with the podcast. When I did The Vanishing of Vivian Cameron, that podcast, I had this flood of people coming in with information and really added to the narrative. But I got to say, after Sarah's podcast, I had very few people getting in touch with me with new information. And it kind of suggests that if Jodie did do it and she told everyone about it and she didn't do it alone and she did it with 1 or 2 or 3 other guys, that other people are going to know and that they're going to come forward. I think there's $1 million reward now, but no one is coming forward to claim that. And I just think, just to look at the difference between the public response to both of those podcasts, if there was something out there, somebody would have got in touch, and they haven't. So if it was Denyer and he didn't tell anyone, I think he could have gotten away with that on his own. He could have done it on his own. He could have dragged her into the bushes. And the fact that she was dragged suggests there weren't 1 or 2 or 3 other people there, because they just would have carried her, one with the legs, one under the arms. But the fact that she was dragged suggests to me maybe there was one person there. And if it was him, he's never told anyone about it.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Jessie Stevens. I'm speaking with true crime author and podcaster Vicky Petratus about the disappearance of Sarah MacDiarmid. You were contacted by someone named Steve who said that he'd actually found Sarah's bag, which isn't something you'd heard before. What was Steve's story?
Steve had a fascinating story. When he got in touch a couple of years before I did the podcast, and he said, I'm the one that found Sarah's bag. And I'm like, oh, Sarah's bag wasn't found as far as I knew. And so we had this lengthy kind of messenger exchange. And it turned out that his story was that he thinks about 10 years after Sarah went missing, he was going through the Seaford retarding basin, which is kind of just behind the railway station. It was normally full of water, and one day it wasn't. And instead of walking around, he's walked through and got his foot caught on what turned out to be the handle of a handbag. And so he and his mate have uncovered it, dug it up, and they looked in it and they found a purse. And he opened up the purse. There was no cash in the purse, but there was a Civic video card and other bank cards, but if he was 17, he wouldn't have known what to do with a bank card if he had have found one. But he kind of joked with his friend, oh, we could go and rent out videos. I wish they had have, because if that card had have pinged, we would have known straight away. But they didn't. They just left it there. The name on it was Sarah MacDiarmid, but he'd, as a local, always heard her referred to as Sarah MacDiarmid, like McDermott, like McDermott. And it wasn't until 6 months after, when he saw the big anniversary articles in the newspaper, that he saw that name written. Sarah's name is kind of spelt like MacDiarmid. And when he saw it written, he went, oh my God, that's the name on the card. So he raced back to the retarding basin to try and find that bag again, but it was gone. And so when he told his mum said, oh, look, this will follow you. And she had, some things going on in their family and in her life. And she's like, no, just don't tell the police. And it wasn't until later on, and this happens all the time with these kind of things, it bugged him, and it was like a weight on his shoulders. He would seek people out, like me and Laurie Ratz, one of the detectives, and he wanted to tell people about it. He did end up going to the police. The police went down to the retarding basin with him. It's one of those things that it's a story, it's not provable, it's not disprovable. And I guess for the police, there's this young man saying, oh, I saw the bag, it's not there. And the story kind of ended there. And I think that's where podcasts come in handy, because I think still Steve felt like, I still got to keep talking about this. I've got to keep telling people. And of course, my first question as a crime writer is, could something else of hers be there, or could she be there? And I just had this picture of knowing Denya, knowing the way that he operated. Could he have left her in the bushes, gone and got a car, driven it round the corner? Being a walker, he would have known that retarding basin. He would have known the factory areas. Could he have dragged her into the mud of the retarding basin? And I just thought, could he have just left her there and then maybe stomped on her like he did with Elizabeth Stevens, and she's gone into the mud, and he's just thought, oh, this is a good way of concealing this. I just couldn't help but feel that that was an area that we needed to look at, we needed to examine.
Because that rang a bell for you, didn't it? The burying of the handbag, because that was familiar to some of the research that you'd done regarding Paul Denya.
Yeah, when Steve got in touch and he said, I found the bag was buried, and I just remembered that he had buried Debbie Freem's purse, and I thought, Denya is a purse burier. So, my spider senses were tingling, because as a crime writer, you're just so familiar with all these details and all this information. And I think anyone who's ever seen any shows on this will never forget that vision that they often play of Denya walking through the hole cut in the wire of the bike track and going in to the area near where he killed Natalie Russell, the same bike track, and scuffing with his foot to uncover the purse. And then he gets the purse out, and then he scuffs again and uncovers the credit cards. So a lot of this rang a bell, that the purse, he says to the detectives, I took the money but left the cards. And that was the same as what Steve had found in the purse that he found at the retarding basin. And I felt like for Denya, these kind of things were a bit of a trophy for him. He could have just discarded the purse, like he did discard the knives that he used. But that purse, I think, when Rod Wilson, the homicide detective, says to him, "Can you find the purse?" And he kind of sits back in his chair, he goes, "Yeah, I'll find it." There was this cockiness about, he knew exactly where it was. And so I wondered if what happened to Sarah was an early practice run maybe for those murders. And I think too, his family thought that he could be responsible for Sarah because his brother David, who he had accused of sexually abusing him when he was a child, David denied that. Paul said that in his interview. When he was asked why he did it, he said, because, my brother David molested me. And David and his wife had just moved back from the UK. It was a time of great stress for all of the Denya family because other family matters had just blown up. So I always wondered whether Sarah could have been a time of great stress, and that's a stressor for a serial killer. Was he roaming around the streets at night and he always carried knives with him? Did he see her get off the train, walk down that stairway? The car park was dark, and did he just take a chance? And was it just a blitz attack that he then came back and took her in a vehicle, either of his own or maybe one that he borrowed from one of his brothers?
For people who don't know the Frankston area particularly well, can you describe how close this basin or the train station is to the sites of Denya's other crimes? Like, are we talking within the same sort of suburb?
If you get a street directory or Google Earth it is extraordinary. So the Kananook railway station faces McCulloch Avenue, and Debbie Frame was taken from McCulloch Avenue. One station down, when he attacked Rosa Toth, the night he took Debbie Frame, he attacked her at Seaford Station and hopped on the train and went one stop down to Kananook. He lived on Frankston Dandenong Road, which if you hopped off the other side of Kananook and went on the overpass to the other side and go down a few streets, there's Frankston Dandenong Road, and across the road from that is the golf course. And the bike track where Nat was taken was the border between that golf course and the one next to it. So Elizabeth was a bit of an outlier. She was in Langwarrin. And even if you go over the overpass, you come out right near Claude Street where he had done the cats. So Laurie writes one of my favourite quotes from the podcast. He says, "You could cast a net over this. It was all in that one space." If you went from the car park along the train line, I think it's about 500 metres down, that's where the retarding basin is. So you could walk to it. We don't think Sarah was carried for the reasons I mentioned earlier, but that's how close it was. If you're catching the train, you go past the retarding basin just before it pulls into the station. It's his stomping ground, and looking at Google Maps in that area just gives me the chills because it just seems so connected.
Yeah, such a close area and such a coincidence if they're not related. In May 2006, there was a coronial inquest because still there's been no body, there's no evidence that directly ties anyone to it. What was the coroner able to find?
The coroner was able to find that Sarah had been murdered that night. The coroner was quite satisfied that she was dead. And that's always hard because, the MacDiarmids, they never talk about her. When you don't have a body, when you don't have a resolution, they always say, look, we know that she is, but, of course you hear of people that are locked up for 30 years. So there's always that glimmer of, well, we don't know for sure. And that's agony. But the coroner found that Sarah was dead. One of the police that did an overview of all the evidence found that there really was no credibility to the stories that Jodie Jones had told people. And I think that was certainly the conclusion that I reached when you're looking at all these different accounts and you're thinking about all the different ways that she might want to say that to impress people. She might want to say that to put fear into people. She knows there's no proof. When the police pull her in to interview her, she knows they can't pin it on her because there's no proof because, I don't think she did do it. But also she had an alibi for that night. Someone came forward and said, yeah, she got to my place in the early evening and she stayed the next couple of days with me. So, there's evidence that she was quite possibly somewhere else when this was all taking place.
Finally, do you think we'll ever find out what happened to Sarah? If this is, potentially a secret being held by a man behind bars, what do you think the chances are that there will be evidence or that there will be someone come forward who can change the course of this case?
I don't hold out any hope that he would ever tell anyone. I think Paul Denyer is a manipulator, and he is and continues to be incredibly dangerous. So I think that secret will die with him. But I think that we will never stop looking. And if someone stumbles upon her remains, just last week I was contacted by a person in Victoria who has a human remains detector dog. Because we had lockdown, it was so hard to organise these things. But she said to me, I'm going to go down and I'm going to take my dog down and we're going to have a look. And so you just never know. If we never give up looking and people continue to come forward and offer different ways of looking, particularly that we have a potential site, what if we find her? That certainly is my dream for her family.
Absolutely, and a site that hasn't been as extensively searched as it could have been at this stage. That seems like the next logical step, which is a pretty important breakthrough.
And they never took dogs through. So we had searched it with a metal detector trying to find the tennis racket, shoe buckles with the handbag of the handle. But it had been resurfaced. But, if she's there, the human remains detector dog handler was fairly confident that the dog would detect it.
Thanks to our guest, Vicky Petratus, for assisting us to tell Sarah's story. Vicky is a best-selling author who's been writing true crime for over 25 years. Recently, she's turned her attention to podcasting in the hopes of uncovering fresh evidence that might bring closure to families of cold case victims just like Sarah. You can hear her full analysis of this case through the link in our episode description. True Crime Conversations is a Mamma Mia podcast hosted by me, Jessie Stevens, and my executive producer is Gia Moylan. If you'd like to find out more about the show, don't forget to join our online community. Just search for True Crime Conversations on Facebook and make a request to join.